I was in London when the election returns came in Mexico on Sunday. And as soon as I saw that the exit polls didn't match the official polls, I said, get me on a plane to Mexico City right now, because I figured I better be here right away to find out what's going on. So I immediately, as soon as I saw that suspicious difference, I said, I have to get down here. What is amazing to me is the way that Mexico is almost a perfect parallel with the United States in terms of questions and problems with the vote and the count of the vote. Okay, I'm looking at nearly identical patterns between Florida of 2000 in the United States and Ohio of 2004. In both those states, we had a tremendous non-count of vote. In fact, very few people in the world, including Americans themselves, have any idea that in the United States in 2004, 3.6 million votes, 3.5 million votes were cast and never counted. That includes two big piles, what is called in Mexico the null vote, and in the United States is called the spoiled vote, where it was 1.5 million. Here you have nearly 1 million votes, even a worse percentage than the United States, which is a terrible percentage, by the way, in the United States. But here is horrendous. Nearly 1 million votes were null votes. That is blank ballots or blank ballots, 2%. You're talking about blank ballots or ballots that they supposedly couldn't read or were spoiled. Now, one way that you correct that problem is to open up those ballots and look at them. And I can tell you from experience in Florida and Ohio that if you actually look at the ballots, they're not blank. You look at the ballots and you can see it's someone trying to vote, and usually their vote is quite clear. And so what happened in Florida is very similar to what happened here. In Florida, the person in charge of counting the votes was named Catherine Harris. She was Secretary of State. But she was not only in charge of counting the votes, she was in charge of the Bush campaign for president. And she made a decision, even though the law said if the vote is within 0.5%, you must recount the ballots. But she stopped that recount as it began. And as the recount was going on, George Bush was about to lose, and she stopped the count when George Bush was only 500 votes ahead. So technically he won the presidency of the United States by just 537 votes out of 100 million votes. So you can't imagine how teeny small that is. And that meant that 178,000 votes were never counted in the state of Florida, just like here. In other words, they were given a preliminary count, quick look, but you have all these votes that they said were blank. Well, if you looked at those votes, in almost all cases, you could see what someone was trying to do, how they were trying to vote, mostly for Al Gore. Here, we see the same problem. You begin to, I guarantee you, if you open up those ballots, you will have a different president. First you have to count those nearly 1 million ballots, which are called null votes. Then the second thing is, because you have paper ballots, you have to recount the votes that have been counted. Every paquete, every package that's been opened up is coming up with a different number than the official tabulation. Well, if every package you open up is different from the tabulation, then it automatically suggests that you might want to open up every packet. And it's not random. Every single packet opened up is giving the challenger, Lopez Obrador, more votes. And given that you have something like 2 votes per voting precinct, or casilla as they call it here, would change the result. So either you read the blank ballots, even if you just read the blank ballots, and by the way, that should only take a couple days to do. It's not that difficult. If you do that, or if you should really recount all of them, that will give you that'll give you a different result. But we saw that same thing in Ohio too, where nearly 1/3 votes were not counted in Ohio in 2004 when George Bush was running for re-election. He won re-election because of the vote in Ohio. But it was not because of the vote that he won. It was because of the votes that weren't counted. And once again, the person in charge of the vote, whose name was Kenneth Blackwell, Secretary of State, was also chairman of the Bush campaign in that state. So he's running the campaign and he's running the vote. And he's saying you can't count these votes, nearly 1/3 Some of the same problems. In fact, and even some of the smaller problems are very similar. In Ohio, voters were stopped from voting because there weren't enough ballots, there weren't enough voting booths. Here, the same thing where you saw in the federal district here, voters who lined up for hours and hours and hours only to find that there weren't enough ballots. So you have the same thing, and again, it's not random. It tends to undermine the vote of the challenger. And finally, I'm looking at one thing that's very, very similar. In Florida, voters were scrubbed from the voter rolls. Their names didn't appear. I understand that we've gotten anecdotal reports of scrubs of the voter rolls here. And I'd be very interested to find out if there's been systematic removal of names as there was in the United States. I mean, we have some anecdotal reports. This is news to me, about 80,000 votes scrubbed in Tabasco. I'd love to get that information because that's exactly one of the keys to election manipulation in the United States. As it turned out, I investigated and found that there was a company called ChoicePoint, which was hired by the state of Florida, and the governor is Jeb Bush, the brother of the president, that the brother of the president hired a private company to give them names to remove from the voter rolls. The excuse being that these voters were criminals, convicted criminals who can't vote. In fact, they weren't convicted criminals, they were just African Americans who tend to vote for the Democratic Party. That's how that was fixed. I've discovered here that there was a contract, another contract by the Bush family to hire the same exact company, ChoicePoint, to grab the voter files of Mexico, which is against Mexican law. But they actually took all the citizenship files of the state of the Mexican nation.
The padrón?
Yeah, they took the padrón. They took the entire citizenship files, all the personal information, driver's licenses, and other information.
Statements.
Yeah, they took all these what's called the citizenship files of Mexico. They were able to get their hands on that, and they gave that to the Bush administration, the Bush government, through a contract with the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and it was called a counterterrorism contract. In other words, they were looking for terrorists. And so the assumption was that they were looking for terrorists like in Saudi Arabia where the hijackers came from. And that we have no terrorists coming into the United States from Mexico. We have no terrorists coming from Venezuela into the United States. But they took the voter files of Venezuela and Mexico. Now, I know that Mexico attempted to arrest Bush's contractors, even though they were working for the U.S. government. And the contractor said they've given back all the files to the Mexican government. But that doesn't mean that George Bush and the U.S. government gave back the files. And so we don't know if it came back around to the PAN. We do know that George Bush is deeply panicked about the outcome of this election in Mexico. And we can't come up with an explanation for stealing the citizenship files of Mexico except to try to have some type of interference in the Mexican political process. That's what we're investigating. That's one of the things we're investigating now. Why would they steal these citizenship files from Mexico? And we need an explanation from the Bush administration. They've refused to give us any answers at all, nor to say whether they've destroyed their own files.